It felt like such a harmless resolution. Everyone makes them, after all. I simply wanted a new me for the new year. Last year had been a joke in every sense of the word. With quarantine, we had been locked down inside for months. The city nearly shut down completely. But we had all been a little hopeful at the beginning that we could use this time to our advantage. I would use it to better myself. I'd learn a new skill. I'd write my book. I'd never go back to my crappy job again. In that time of uncertainty, we all settled in with high hopes of coming out with something better than we'd started. Turns out, I only managed one of those things. I would never go back to my crappy job because I was laid off halfway through the year. I spent the next 6 months wallowing in self-pity, watching Netflix and adding quarantine weight to my belt. My exercise plan went by the wayside. My plans to better myself didn't seem to matter. And as my wife started her new job at the grocery store, her job had also let her go, I settled into depression like a crab in its shell. As I sat on the couch, one show after another rolling past, I saw little reason to do much of anything. When Christmas rolled around, I realized it had been 9 months since I'd done anything of value, and that was when the depression set in. I spent Christmas morning in a funk, sitting in my sweatpants and watching our kids open their meager gifts. My wife sat in the armchair opposite me, looking tired but happy with the gifts she had gotten them. She'd bought everything, paid for everything, because I was too lazy and unmotivated to do much of anything. Every now and then, I would catch these little looks from her, little disappointed looks tinged with sadness. All I could do was wallow in my sadness, though, not sure what I could do to change it. When New Year's came, I just stayed in bed. I didn't feel worthy to join the others for their midnight toasts or their energetic countdowns. As I heard them count down, I closed my eyes and felt myself make more of a wish than a resolution. 5, I wanted a new me for the new year. 4, a better me. 3, for them. 2, someone they could be proud of. 1, someone who wouldn't let them down. Happy New Year! I dozed off to the sound of them ringing in the new year, hoping I would awake to find that I'd found the strength to make my resolution a reality. I woke up to the smell of eggs and bacon, pancakes and syrup, and hearty laughter from downstairs. They had started breakfast without me. The first breakfast of the year was a tradition of ours. Why wouldn't they? I hadn't exactly been there the last few months. Why would now be any different? Why not now? Why not make good on my resolution? I got dressed in something other than sweatpants and came downstairs to the laughter of my family. Someone was sitting at the head of the table, though, telling a story that had all of them in stitches, and I felt a little miffed as I came to the foot of the stairs. Who was this guy? He sounded a little familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. They hadn't woken me up to eat, and now there was some stranger in my house. What the hell was going on? Lisa, why didn't you tell me we had company? But Lisa said nothing. She had eyes only for this charismatic stranger who was sitting in my chair. Brad? Janet? Did anyone save me any pancakes? I'm as hungry as... So glad you woke up to make these pancakes this morning, dear, Lisa said, raising her orange juice glass to the man at the head of the table. What can I say? The guy said, and as I moved around to confront him, I took a step back in surprise. I was as hungry as a bear this morning. It was me. I was sitting at the head of the table. I was still the same as I was now, but I looked different somehow. My face was shaved, my hair was cut down from the greasy tangles it was now, and I had dressed in some normal clothes. I was wearing an apron, smudged with flour and speckled with grease. More than that, though, I seemed to exude a healthy glow. I was a mess, but I could get better. I was filled with an energy that let people know I was changed. I was full of vigor, full of life, full of pep. I kept yelling at them as they ate, trying to get someone's attention, but they all just kept eating, kept laughing, kept living as though I didn't exist. I made a joke then, my family's laughter the backdrop for the screams that came ripping up my throat as I slowly lost my mind. When he picked up their plates and walked them to the kitchen, I followed him. I kept jabbering at the back of his head, the catharsis the only thing that mattered now. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. I yelled at him to get out of my house and leave my family alone, and to stop pretending to be me. He stood there, washing dishes as I screamed at him, and when I was done, he just laughed. "When are you gonna wake up? I'm you now," he said, turning around to look at me, my own face smiling back in the face of my confusion, "and I have no intention of going anywhere." I took a step away from him, my anger turning to confusion. What are you?" I gasped, backing into the counter as I tried to get away from this strange homunculus. "I'm you, the best you, and soon I'll be the only you." I stayed for about a month just to watch over them, just to watch him. He was the perfect husband, though, the perfect father, the perfect man. He went to my son's Little League games. He went to my daughter's band recitals. He remembered my wife's birthday, remembered her favorite food, and he made time for her every day. He got out and found a job working at a warehouse, and after a month, they talked about making him an assistant manager. He cooked dinners and read bedtime stories, and was the husband and father that my family deserved. And I was there to watch it all as my family gathered around him and became the focal point once again. After a month of living like a ghost in my own house, I left and never looked back. I began to walk one day and just didn't stop for a while. I expected to disappear, to stop existing, but I found that the opposite was true. The farther I walked, the more I began to feel alive again. I hadn't noticed while I'd been watching my family live with this strange man, but I hadn't felt the urge to eat or drink that whole time. The farther I moved from my house, the more I realized I was becoming hungrier and thirstier. I had brought my wallet with me out of habit, and the cheeseburger and fries I bought tasted heavenly. I was able to use my debit card and my credit card for a little while, but after a few months they stopped working, and I was forced to work odd jobs in order to feed and clothe myself. By some stroke of luck, I had purchased some things I would need to survive in my new homeless lifestyle before my credit card was turned off. It wasn't much, but it helped me get far enough away from my old home that people could see me again. It's proximity that seemed to trigger it. At least that's what Malcolm thinks. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. About 6 months ago, a year into my journey, I met a homeless guy at a soup kitchen, and we started talking about our past lives. I told him how I'd left my family, making it sound like my wife had left me for another man, but he just smiled and shook his head. He said he had a similar story, his wife leaving him for someone else, but it wasn't just anyone. She left me for another me, just like your wife. I was speechless, but when I asked how he could know that, he told me a very familiar story. Malcolm had been a company man. He had worked long hours, holidays, birthdays, missing most of the important memories from his child's lives. One of those special events was a particular vacation where his son had drowned while he was at a board meeting. His wife and daughters were distraught. John had been the baby of his family, and they had all doted on him. But Malcolm had only thrown himself harder into his work to hide his grief. One night, New Year's Eve actually, his wife had come to him and said that she felt like she was in a shell of a marriage and that she needed a partner more than a bank account. I stood looking down from my office on the 12th floor and let my grief wash over me at last. I wished for a better me, for the man my wife deserved, and I suppose I got it. When I woke up at my desk the next day, I was like Ebenezer Scrooge after the ghosts had come to visit him. I rushed home, wanting to apologize for never being there for them, but I was already there. I was sitting at the table. I was talking with them and telling them that I was going to turn over a new leaf, and when I saw myself looking through the window, I just smiled at me with the biggest shit-eating grin I could muster. Malcolm, the new Malcolm, had sold his shares of the company, giving ownership to the board, and left a rich man. He had taken Malcolm's family away, moving somewhere he could retire and show them the attention they deserved. Malcolm had never seen them again. He had haunted his empty house for a few months, unsure of where they had gone, but eventually the cops had come and found him squatting there. They could see me again, now that my family was gone, and they rousted me from the house. I told them who I was, but they just laughed at me and told me to keep dreaming. I showed them my ID, my credit cards, and they threw me in jail, believing I was a thief. I spent 3 years in prison for petty theft before getting out and hitting the road. That was 20 years ago, and I've been on the move ever since. I travel with Malcolm now. We found 2 others since we set out, too. They seem drawn to us somehow. Our shared grief and sense of strangeness seems to call to them. They both have similar stories, similar wishes, and it seems that their wishes also came true. So give some thought before you wish for a new self in the new year. Your new self may just make your old self obsolete. Jeffry hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffry was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffry had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffry had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffry was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like, a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffry. What kind of prank? Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffry had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffry's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big, something they'll never forget, Jeffry said, grinning hugely. Jeffry was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffry wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffry's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons, too. The 2 of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffry obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffry knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends. More than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-o'-lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. They'll need to be full face too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy. My bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. Don't forget, Jeffrey reminded him. I've got this, guys, Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, I still haven't heard from Kevin. Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school, Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it, Chris said. We don't know that, Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed. Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for the scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffrey could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required 6-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45 they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffry had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffry reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffry was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffry had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffry felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffry as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffry was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffry was pretty sure it was Mr. Bask, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffry just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffry had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Bask, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffry's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffry released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffry for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffry came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the street light seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffry was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffry nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffry finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffry had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him, and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffry's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffry felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffry its power. As Jeffry rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffry had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffry was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffry thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffry felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffry expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffry for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffry found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffrey saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Through it all, Jeffry said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffry said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffry refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffry never saw him again. Jeffry never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffry smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffry had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffry had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffry crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffry slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The Green Man called Jeffry to action, and who was he to deny? December 12th. We were getting ready for school when Aaron found the fire truck. It was a big one with an adjustable ladder and small hoses that spooled and unspooled as needed. There were two firefighters in the front seat in full gear with their axes in hand and their respirators on tight. Aaron rushed over to the tree in a wild excitement as he started zooming it around the room. I saw something fall out of the back compartment then and flutter to the ground. I figured it was from my dad, Aaron's grandfather, who had been a strict disciplinarian turned soft old grandpa in his old age. I picked it up and opened it. There was a message inside, and it was short and a little cryptic. To remind you of the first time you strayed. S. The first time I'd what? That was clearly not meant for Aaron. The truck was, but not the note. What was my dad talking about? The first time I'd strayed from what? As I sat and watched Aaron zoom the truck around the living room, though, I suddenly remembered. The first time I'd strayed. The first time I'd been unfaithful. Reggie and I had only been dating a few weeks when Kevin moved into the apartment next door. He was something. 220 pounds, a solid muscled fireman, and he had only had one look at me in my short skirt and crop top before he'd been forced to look away. It took me a few weeks to muster up the nerve to bring some cookies over for him and his roommate, and they had had plenty of time to cool as I flipped the card over to see if there was anything on the back before I crumbled it up and put it in the garbage. My dad had always been a bit of a religious. I guess it came with the territory when you were a minister, but this was going too far. How did he even know? I'd only ever told maybe two people about Kevin, and he wouldn't have been able to talk to either one of them. Maybe I'd told Mom, I decided, and figured I'd just let it pass. We were living in their rental house after all, and I didn't want to mess anything up between us. I should have said something there and then, though. December 13th. We got home from school. Aaron found a play school tool belt complete with hammer, saw, and screwdriver. It hadn't been there when we left for school, so I figured it was another surprise from Dad. I set about making dinner as Aaron went around, pretending to fix this and that with his new tools. I didn't give it much thought until he brought me another small note that he'd found in the pocket of the work belt. "It must be yours, Mommy," he said in a childish treble. "I can't read." And then he went back to playing. Great, another sermon from my father. This one was short too, to remind you of the handyman who was oh so handy. S. That would be Jim. Jim was our handyman. Reggie had hired him to fix the place up when we'd gotten married, since he was too busy at work to do his own repairs. The house had been a gift from Reggie on our wedding day. His parents had left him a small fortune after they died, and he had found a new house for his new wife. He'd been working long hours back then, 12 and 16-hour days, but Jim had been more than happy to keep me company and keep me warm when Reggie was at work. I threw this one in the trash too. My anger clouded my mind, or I might have suspected something even then. Who the hell did my dad think he was? Leaving gifts for Aaron and chastisement for me? I had probably told Mom about Jim too. There was that time when Mom liked to live vicariously through me and my little dalliances, but I couldn't believe that she would tell my prudish father about all these indiscretions. I made a mental note to talk to him and went back to making dinner. I still hadn't grasped the depths of what was going on. December 14th. The police car came next. I was trying to coax Aaron out of his pajamas and into his school clothes. He was having a bad morning, and he'd slept poorly the night before because of the wind. To speed him along, I had suggested that maybe we could see if Grandpa had left another present under the tree today. He got dressed quickly after that, but he laughed and said it wasn't Grandpa leaving things under the tree. "It's Santa, Mommy," he said, as though I was slow not to get it. "Santa leaves toys under the tree." "Of course," I said, pulling on his sweater. "It must be Santa. He's rewarding you for being such a good boy throughout the whole endeavor." "What's an endeavor?" he asked. He was always so curious. "It's just a hard time, honey. Let's go have a look and see if we left you anything while we eat breakfast and get ready for school, okay?" The police car was sitting right in plain sight. There was another note, of course, and this one was preachier than the last. "To remind you of the policeman who gave you more than a ticket. S." My freaking mom had been running her mouth again. I didn't even remember this one's name, but he'd been so cute on his little motorcycle. He had gotten me for speeding, and I had been. But a flash of the girls and a promise to let him put his handcuffs on me had gotten me out of that little jam. We'd spent a hot hour or so in the back of his squad car, and off I'd gone about my day. When I'd caught pregnant a few months later, Reggie and I had been trying after all, but Aaron did have the cop's sandy hair. I called my parents' house, but no one answered. Dad must be out early, maybe shopping with my mom or something, and I decided to call them that night. I'd had enough of Dad and his high-handed notes and his little spoiling gifts. I had never had a good relationship with Dad. What we had now was grudging love on my end, and a father trying his best to support his straying daughter kind of love on his. I would tolerate being in his debt, but I wouldn't tolerate his judgmental ways. I wish now I'd maybe tried a little harder. December 15th. When we got home from school that night, I found the football with a note taped to it. Was he worth it? S. Aaron loved football, of course, but I didn't love the memory it brought. Derek was young, still in high school, and I'd seen him and his friends playing football in the street. From the moment I'd seen him, I'd wanted him. He had long blonde hair, he was built like a professional linebacker, and when he smiled, you could see all the carefree love of life that exists in someone who hasn't had their dreams smushed back in their face yet. He was going to LSU, he told me, as he lay naked under the covers on my bed. He was going to LSU and he was going to be a football star. He'd get drafted by some pro team, and maybe he'd even take me with him. I was the best lay he'd ever had, after all, and being with him had made me feel 16 again. Not a 30-year-old mother who'd never quite lost all the baby weight and knew she wasn't as sexy as she had been once. Didn't Reggie tell me so? Not with his words, but with his actions, with his lack of affection, with his lack of attention. I had liked it. I had liked him. I didn't like this note. I tried to call Dad again, but their home phone went to machine. It was 8 o'clock at night, for God's sake. Where the hell were they? Didn't old people usually go to bed early? I'd call him in the morning, I told myself. I'd call him and put a stop to this. If he wanted to give Aaron toys, he could wait until Christmas like a normal person. This needed to stop. December 16th. That morning, I found the straw that broke the camel's back. There was a children's craftsman workbench in my living room, bristling with tools and little building projects, and Aaron ran to it like well, like a kid on Christmas morning. He put on the hard hat and went to get his tool belt so he could get to work, but I was already searching for the note. Where was it, Dad? Where was today's sermon? I already thought I knew what it would say, but I needed to see it, needed to read it. I nearly tore it in half opening it when I found it in the tool bench's little cubby. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? You needed seconds. S. Jim had gotten in touch with me after Aaron was a year old. He said he thought about me often and wanted to see me again. Reggie was at home more now, liked to spend time with the baby, so I had gone to book clubs or got a gym membership so I could get out of the house for a while and feel less stir-crazy. These trips were always to a nearby hotel, so Jim and I could rekindle our relationship in private. After 3 sweet weeks, he told me that his wife wanted to try and work things out, and I never saw him again after that. I did tear the note in half after I'd read it. I called my parents' house in a blind rage. Dad picked up on the second ring, and he sounded like he'd been awake for hours. I could hear Mom puttering about the kitchen in the background, and before he spoke, he swallowed a bit of whatever he'd been eating. I could see Mom now as she cooked his breakfast and ironed his clothes, and he just sat at the table and wrote his sermons and got ready for another day of being retired. "Good morning, sweetie. Is everything okay? Did the wind do any damage last? You know perfectly well that my house is fine, Dad. I want to know why you keep leaving these little notes and toys under my Christmas tree." I was angry. I was fuming, and I was expecting some high-handed religiosity about being sure your sins will find you out, or polluting the garden of your marriage with strange seeds. But I got none of that. What I got was confusion. Toys? Sweetheart, I haven't been over to your house in about a week. Not since we watched Aaron, so you could go to that office party. We went to see friends out of town. We left Monday night, remember? We only just got back last night. I saw that you'd called, but it was so late that I didn't bother calling you back. I shuddered, my blood running a little cold as he said it. Put Mom on, I breathed. Sweetheart, I don't Put Mom on the phone, I shouted. I must have startled him, because I heard the phone fall out of his hand and hit the linoleum with a hard thump. Someone picked it up, and I heard quiet chatter on the other end. My dad's concerned, gruff voice, and my mother's softer, more consoling tone in answer. She was always the peacemaker, always the Kissinger, always the one who soothed things over. "Honey, what's wrong? Is Aaron okay? Did you guys really just get back from a trip? You really haven't been here all week?" There was a heavy pause, and then, "Yeah, we left to see friends. We told you that, dear. We told you we'd be gone for a few days. Is everything okay? You sound very... Have you told Dad anything about what we talked about? About my slips from the path a proper woman should take?" That's what we always called them. We used the term in tones of deepest sarcasm, but we'd always called my sexual adventures by that name. I would call Mom up and tell her in a mournful voice that I'd slipped from the path that a proper woman should take, and she would tell my father that she needed to take this in the bedroom, and then ask for details as she got her thrills vicariously. "No," she said, and I could almost hear her look at Dad. "Never, dear. Did something happen? I hung up on her. Aaron and I stayed at home that day and didn't answer the door. I made a trip to Walmart after lunch and picked up a new lock for the door that I installed. If Dad really was playing games, something I was beginning to doubt, he would have to knock first before he played them. December 17th. The little suit came next. It was Saturday, and Aaron was up early to watch cartoons. I told him to make a bowl of cereal and not make a big mess on the floor. I didn't hear any squeals of joy from the living room, so I figured that there was no secret surprise today. I went back to sleep until about 9, and then got up, my own stomach beginning to rumble, to see what I could find to eat. I dropped the eggs on the floor when I looked into the living room and saw what was hanging by the fireplace. It was an expensive, coal-black suit for a child of 6. Aaron was less interested in it, but it didn't need a note to tell me what this one was for. I found one anyway. It was stuffed in the breast pocket, and as I unfolded it, I already knew what it was likely to say. "Nothing was sacred to you, not even my job. S." I had slept with Reggie's boss about 6 months after Jim had stopped calling. I couldn't tell you why I did it. I did it because I could, I guess, and his boss just looked so good in his Armani suit. Our fling was passionate, but burned out fast. 3 months in, and he traded me for a newer model, a secretary with high breasts and well-formed backside, and I sulked off into the distance. Tongues must have wagged about the office, though, because this was the first one Reggie had found out about. He hadn't accused me of it. He'd simply asked me why people were saying that I was screwing his boss. I'd admitted to it, and instead of raging or throwing me out, he had hugged me and said he was sorry for not giving me more attention. He said he wanted us to go to marriage counseling. He said he wanted to be a better man, the kind of man that I deserved. I made another trip to Walmart and bought a flip lock for the door. I also bought locks for the windows and a chain for the back door. I considered a selection of guns in the sporting goods section, but I decided against them. Aaron was young and curious, and if he'd gotten hurt with one, I don't know what I would have done. Dad came over while I was installing things and asked what was wrong. I told him I'd seen someone around the property and was just being careful. He asked if I wanted to borrow a gun, and I told him no. I didn't want one around Aaron, and I was sure that it was nothing. He shrugged and invited me over for dinner later if I wanted. Then he walked back to the house through the field as he always did. I had lied to Dad. I wasn't sure that it was nothing, and became less sure that it was nothing with every day that passed. The note read, "My job." Dad wouldn't have signed it like that. Only one person would have signed it like that, and that person was currently in a padded room somewhere, eating his meals through a tube and screaming himself to sleep. Reggie couldn't be out, and even if he couldn't find us. He couldn't. December 18th. The gift was a costume. Aaron liked costumes. All children like costumes. But this one was exceptionally telling. I was getting ready for church, a job made all the harder thanks to Dad and his Pentecostal ways, and when Aaron jumped out in the red devil costume, I thought I was going to drop dead of a heart attack. I had dressed him about an hour ago. He only had an hour before he tried to ruin his clothes out of sheer little boy curiosity, and when I came into the living room, I saw them thrown haphazardly over the couch. I'd been trying to put in an earring, and the sight of all those children's clothes scattered about made me so mad that I dropped the back. It rolled under the couch, of course, and as I bent down to get it, I yelled at Aaron to come put these clothes back on and hurry up or we'll be late. When I stood up, there he was, red devil costume and pitchfork held high, as he yelled, "Boo!" right in my face. I fell, tearing my dress and scuttling backwards on my butt as the apparition loomed up before me over the couch. He laughed then, fit to split as my gran would have said, and pulled back the hood to reveal that it was just him. He climbed in my lap and gave me a kiss, my stunned face and overloaded body too keyed up to respond, and said he'd found it under the tree. Santa had brought him a costume for next Halloween, probably because he had missed it this year, and it was so cool and neat, and I barely heard him. I just picked him up and put him in his room and closed the door. The note was lying on the floor next to the tree. Aaron must have thrown it there in his haste to have the costume out. I bent down slowly, and with shaking hands, I picked it up. It was the same notes I'd been getting for the last 6 days. Simply, write your own message notes on a plain white envelope, and I almost dropped it as I opened it to see what my Secret Santa had written this time. A Halloween treat to go with your Halloween trick. S. We'd been in marriage counseling for about a month when I realized that the problem was not my husband. Reggie felt that he was working too much, that he was too focused on his job, that he wasn't an attentive enough husband, and that my cheating was just my way of showing him the error of my ways. He was too hard on himself. I had been kind of a floozy since before we met, but the therapist had showed me something that maybe I hadn't wanted to admit to. The problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was with me. Halloween night, and I was on candy duty. Reggie had taken the night off, and he and Aaron, now 2, had gone out trick-or-treating. He had asked if I wanted to go. All of us had dressed as devils, which I just knew my dad would love when he got the pictures, but I had said no. I told them I was having cramps or some other woman problem, and made my excuses that I'd just slow them down. So off they went, Daddy Devil in his long red cloak and horns, and Baby Devil toddling along at his hand, and Mommy Succubus was free to prowl. Like the cop, I didn't even know his name, but he too was dressed like a devil, and when he sent his kids up the way to keep trick-or-treating, I let him feel a little of my hellfire right there in the entryway. He left with a treat, and so did I. You see, the problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was that now and then, I just liked a little strange. We didn't leave the house that day. The phone rang, but I didn't answer it. Dad came by to see where we were, but I didn't answer the door either. He yelled a little bit when his key wouldn't open the lock, but eventually he left, and I went back to staring off into space as Aaron watched movies on his old VHS TV. He wore the costume, even though I hated it, and before bed that night, I triple-checked the locks and even put a chair under the door. I needn't have bothered. It didn't do any good. December 19th. There was a remote-controlled speedboat and another note. So you remember your time on the water. S. I had met the man with the speedboat while we'd been at the lake house. He was tan and fit, and he'd been watching me sunbathe all day. When he invited me onto his boat, I asked, coyly, if he didn't think his wife would mind. He said he really didn't care, and I found that I didn't either. His boat hadn't been the only thing to go fast, though. We stayed home again, and I made another trip to Walmart. I changed the locks again and bought a camera system for outside. December 20th. We stayed home again after I found a doctor's outfit under the tree. Did you enjoy your weekly doctor's visit? S. Dr. Klein had been my gynecologist for years. His seduction was the easiest of all, and he knew his way around my body better than I did. He dropped me as a client afterwards, but at least he didn't tell anyone. I always thought that was decent of him, more decent than I deserved. I spent the day going over the camera footage. It was a night vision model, so I knew I'd be able to see anyone creeping up at night, but in the hours of spooling through the footage, I found absolutely no one. Not a deer, not a raccoon, not a prowler, not so much as an exceptionally large moth. Aaron was starting to notice that something was wrong, but I told him that Mommy was sick and I needed him to go play so that I could feel better. I found him asleep on the floor of his room, still in that awful devil costume, and trundled him to bed before taking up my vigil on the couch. I stayed up all night that night, sitting in the living room and drinking wine from the bottle. I must have dozed off after I finished the bottle, because when I woke up, December 21st, there was a briefcase under the tree with the initials RF on a gold plate. I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece and back at the briefcase. I had been asleep for no more than 30 minutes, and in that time, someone had come in and left this thing here. I got off the couch and crawled over to the briefcase on my hands and knees. My head was swimming and my heart was pounding, but I needed to see what was inside. I knew who RF was. Randall had been our family attorney and had even been my counsel during the trial, and I was afraid of what I would find inside the briefcase. The combination was put in already, Aaron's birthday, and when I clicked it open, I had to stifle a scream. Inside was a note and a gold signet ring that also had RF stamped on it. The ring was covered in dried blood. I'd counsel you to think about your many sins. S. Randall had been a family friend for years. We'd gone to the same school, the same church, and known many of the same people all our lives. I knew he had a crush on me. He had a crush on me since Sunday school, and I suspected I might need him in my corner at some point or another. When I'd invited him to my bed, you'd have thought Christmas had come early. He was an adequate lover, enthusiastic if not well equipped, and by that point, Reggie had begun to suspect that therapy wasn't working. He'd go right on suspecting it for another year or two, before he finally had his breakdown. I called Dad then. It was the middle of the night, and I expected to find him groggy and grumpy, but for some reason he was awake. He said that something had been nagging at him for a few days, and he'd gotten up to have a glass of water and read his Bible when I'd called. I called him over to the house right then and there and told him everything. I told him about my cheating. I told him about how my marriage had imploded. I told him about why Reggie had gone crazy. I told him about the gifts and the notes and everything that terrified me, and he took me in his arms and calmed me down. We reviewed the footage from my new cameras, and after a few hours, he too could find nothing. He left for a few hours, and when he came back, he had a sleeping bag and a .38 in a holster. Your mother's going to watch the house for a few days while I stay here. We'll catch whoever's sneaking into your house, hon. Never fear. I wish he'd been right. December 22nd. Dad woke me up at 4:30 a.m. and told me to come have a look at this. I'd been startled awake as he shook me, and I detached myself from Aaron and pulled on my house coat as I went into the living room. I'd brought Aaron into my room to sleep. It certainly made me feel better, if nothing else, and he'd wound himself around me in that way that children always seem to. I'd been dreaming of Reggie. Reggie also had his way of constricting me in the night as we cuddled, and in my dreams he turned into a big snake that was squeezing the life out of me. He'd struck at my face just as Dad had woken me up, and I'd probably startled Dad with the violent way I came awake. As I came into the living room, I could see Dad's sleeping bag beside the couch. It was rumpled and looked like he'd come out of it in a hurry. He pointed to the fireplace, and I saw a wrapped box sitting there with a neat card attached to the top. Dad said he couldn't have dozed off for more than an hour, and when he'd woken up, the box was just there. It was a big box, wrapped in holiday paper and topped with a bow. The card looked spooky, almost skeletal, and as I took it, I had already figured out that this present wasn't for Aaron. This gift was for me. We told him how we felt, but how did he make you feel? S. He was talking about Dr. John. Dr. John had been our counselor for 3 years before I finally pulled him off his high horse. I'd had to tell him every one of my dirty little secrets, and I could tell that over the years, he was getting more than interested. He was the one that listened. He was the one who was there, and what he lacked in the looks department, he made up for in experience. I opened the box and immediately dropped it with a throaty scream. It fell sideways, and a pair of arms fell onto the fireplace. They were starting to gray a little, but they were still recognizable. They had been hacked off at the elbows, and they were covered in coarse black hair that ran halfway up the hands. Dr. John had been possessed of very hairy arms, and even the backs of his fingers had little black hairs on them. They didn't have to be his arms. They could be the arms of any man. But I suddenly knew that they were his. I knew how the person knew who all my lovers were, too. John had probably been happy to tell him if it might save his own life. He told Reggie that we were sleeping together after all. I burned them outside in a burn barrel, and despite my dad's objections, I did not call the police. December 23rd. There was no package that morning. Dad was up and making coffee when I awoke, and he handed me a plate of eggs and said it had been a quiet night. He asked if I minded if he went home and got some sleep. I said I didn't care and promised to call him if anything happened. He left me the gun, telling me to keep it out of Aaron's hands, and left through the field back to his house. I wish I'd said more to him. I wish I'd told him I loved him, but it's too late for that now. Aaron and I had an almost normal day. We ate breakfast, watched TV, and even wrapped a few gifts for Mom and Dad as I sat with Aaron and watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman tell their tale for the 1,000th time. There was no school to call out from. School was on break until the first of the year, and Aaron and I just enjoyed a nice, quiet day at home. Around 5:30, I realized I needed tape to finish wrapping. We got into the Range Rover and went to the store a few miles up the road. Mom and Pop stores were closed up, but the chain stores were usually open this time of year and could be counted on not to close until Christmas. I got some stuff for dinner, the tape, some more wrapping paper, and wished the bored-looking clerk behind the counter a Merry Christmas as Aaron and I went back to the car. I stopped in the parking lot as fine white snow began to fall all around us. Aaron laughed and danced in excitement, catching the snow in his mouth and jumping around as children do in the snow. The wetness fell around me, but I was lost to it. I had eyes only for the Range Rover, for the windshield, for the monstrous lump that sat in the front seat and grinned at me menacingly from behind the steering wheel. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there it sat like a cancerous sore on the front seat of the SUV, mocking me. A Christmas present with a familiar white card. Aaron was sullen the whole way home. "I want to open the present, Mommy," he whined as I slid through the deepest snows and tried to call my parents' house again and again. "It's for me! It's from Santa!" "No, Aaron, this present is for Mommy. I'm just sure of it," I said with false glee. The phone in my hand rang and rang and rang again. Why weren't they answering? Surely they haven't gone out now. Dad must be awake. I needed them. For what felt like the first time in my life, I needed him, and I had a sick feeling in my guts that I'd never see either of them again. Aaron and I pulled up in front of their house, and it sat dark and still. 5:30 should have been prime time for my parents. Dinner to eat, paperbacks to read, crosswords to complete, Mom's knitting needles clicking away, and the darkness inside made me feel sure of what I already knew I'd find. "It looks scary, Mommy," Aaron said, and I agreed with him wholeheartedly. I didn't want to take him inside. I didn't want to go inside at all, but I knew I couldn't just leave them in there. I unbuckled his seatbelt and took him by the hand, and we walked inside the dark house where I did not want to go. The door was unlocked. It opened on oiled hinges and gave out none of that creepy funhouse squeal you always hear in the movies. The living room fire was out, and Mom and Dad's easy chairs looked like crouched ogres in the darkness. I flipped on the lights, and the cheery Christmas tree lights blinked into illumination. The overhead lights didn't come on, and as we walked in, I heard glass snap under my boots. The naked light that hung from the ceiling fan had blown, or had been broken, and in the twisting light of the Christmas tree, we made our way to the kitchen. That's where we found Mom. She'd been doing dishes when someone had come upon her, and she hung out of the sink like a rag doll. She'd been drowned. Someone had held her head under the soapy water until she stopped breathing, and now she slumped in the sink like a woman taking a nap. Aaron stepped back, asking what was wrong with Grandma, but I turned him away from the grisly scene and off towards my parents' room. Dad was in there. Someone had cut his throat. I closed the door and took us to the guest room. That was where I opened today's present, the box I had taken from the Range Rover. The box contained a broken pair of glasses and a tweed coat that was drenched in blood. I sobbed as I saw them, knowing immediately who they belonged to. Samuel had been the love of my life. He was a professor of literature at the local community college, and I'd been taking his class as a lark. He was old enough to be my father, but the smell of pipe smoke and old books that hung around him made me feel safe. He was a generous lover. He would have made a better father to Aaron than Reggie could ever have, and I'd been preparing to leave Reggie for Samuel. I never got the chance. Reggie had caught us in bed together. There had been no time to excuse or apologize. Reggie had shot him in the chest 6 times, and then he turned the gun on me. He dry-fired it another 6 times before realizing it was empty. Reggie had let the gun slip out of his fingers, tears streaming down his face, and simply sat down to wait for the police. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed. He just went limp and waited. 2 months later, he was in a psychiatric facility, and I was moving into my parents' rental home. Now they were dead, and I was left with nothing. Aaron pulled on my arm, and I could tell that he was crying. Well, not nothing, I guess. December 24th. I had meant to leave that very night, but when I went out to the Range Rover, all 4 tires were slashed. Ditto on Dad's truck and Mom's van. I locked the doors and stayed awake all night, waiting for him. No presents appeared, no one came to bother us, and now it's midday on Christmas Eve, and I've finally done what I should have done a week ago. What I should have done when I got the box with the freaking arms in it. The dispatcher didn't seem to understand what I was saying at first, but he finally understood that I'm in the house with 2 bodies and a jacket that is likely murder evidence of some sort or another. I'm waiting in the guest room for them, running my hands over Aaron's duck fuzz of blonde hair. He's asleep, thank God, but I don't know how much longer he'll be able to sleep. The police will have a lot of questions, and I'm sure they will have many for him. I never received Reggie's 12th gift, and I don't think I want to. The wrapped box on the hood of my SUV has been there since morning, but the snow has covered it now, and it's little more than a lump of white. Reggie set out to give me a gift I'd never forget, and he certainly accomplished that. I'll never forget how terrible a human being I am, and how little I deserve the love of the boy that's now sleeping on my lap. Reggie managed to do what years of counseling never could accomplish, and for that, I guess I owe him some thanks. I'm all stranged out for the rest of my life, however long that might be, and if you're reading this, then I ask you to feel no pity for me. My 12 gifts have been well received, and the message was clear. I can see him in the front yard now, waiting for me to come out and get my gift so he can give Aaron his Christmas present. The gift of being free of me. Terry was walking past his parents' room when he heard his mother's frustrated exclamation.
can't believe I have to work all Easter weekend, she bemoaned, sitting on the bed as she tried to stop her tears. His father was shaving in the bathroom and looked like he was only half listening. Terry thought she had probably gotten off easy, since now Dad was going to have to handle Easter by himself. He would have to color the eggs, make the Rice Krispie bunnies, hide the eggs, sneak out the baskets at night, and generally take care of Terry and his sister. His parents would have likely been a little sad to know that at 10, their son no longer believed in these things. Had, in fact, peeked while his mother set the baskets out last year. But he wasn't breathing a word of it to Laura, so she'd still be excited about the coming of the bunny. "The kids will be sad to not see you Sunday morning," his father commented, wincing as the razor nicked him. One look at Mom told Terry that was the wrong thing to have said. "Thanks, Randy, 'cause I don't feel bad enough as it is. I'm looking at working 16 to 15 hours a day for the next 3 days, and you throw something like that at me." His dad held toilet paper to the cut, but Terry thought the wound he had dealt his mother might be worse. I didn't mean anything by it," he corrected, finishing up with the shaving cream on the left side of his face. "It was just—" "Well, don't worry then," she said, getting up and turning for the door. "I'll just sleep in the guest room after I get done dragging myself in so I won't disturb you. I wouldn't want you to miss any sleep so you're fresh to deal with the kids all weekend." When his dad commented that wasn't fair, he set off a shouting match that lasted for the better part of 30 minutes. Terry had seen his parents fight before. Their arguments were something that were starting to become more frequent as of late, and Terry thought it might be because they never saw each other. His mother worked long hours at her job, and his father worked opposite her, making more money than she could from breaking her back, as she often said. They tried to hide these fights from him and Laura, but both had heard them and knew better than to get involved. So, when his mother slapped his father hard enough to rock his head to the side, it surprised her as much as it did Terry. She stood like a statue for a pregnant moment, the two of them caught in tableau, both too afraid to move lest their marriage just shatter like a soap bubble. I have to go to work," she stuttered, grabbing her coat from the bed as she walked to the door. Terry scuttled away, but he saw her shadow as she stopped in the door like she meant to say something else. She left instead, her slip-safe shoes making a crink noise on the floor as she walked. Terry just stood there, unsure of what to do now, afraid to move, lest she should hear him and turn around. But when the door closed in the living room, he knew she was gone. He still couldn't bring himself to move just yet, not sure what to make of this new development. He had heard them fight, but never liked this before. He peeked back through the door and saw his father, looking at the mark in the mirror. He was trying to be stoic, but to Terry, it looked like he was having trouble figuring out what that slap had meant. Terry trotted down the hall while his dad was distracted, wanting to be in the living room with Laura when he finally came to check on them. She was watching Paw Patrol on the couch, but it didn't really look like she was paying attention. She glanced up when Terry sat next to her, and he could tell that she'd been listening. She was 4, but she already knew well to listen when her parents fought. It was how you could tell if Mom was going to come into the living room to play with you, or if she was going to sit in her room and cry. It was how you could tell if Dad might want to throw the ball around, or if he was likely to growl at you to go play somewhere else. "I'm tired of this," Terry said, turning to look at the TV as he watched the pups save a bunch of ducks. "Me too," Laura said, not even having to ask. "I don't want Mommy and Daddy to leave, but I hate when they fight. Sometimes I wish they would leave," Terry said, and Laura looked at him as she covered her mouth with her hands. "Don't say that, Terry. Who would take care of us?" "I don't know," he growled, feeling her sweaty hand slip into his, "but anyone would be better than them fighting all the time." They sat in silence for a while as the show went off and something else came on. Terry wasn't really paying attention to it anyway. He had learned early in life that when you were watching TV, nothing else really seemed important. You could ignore your parents fighting, your sister crying as your mom cried from the next room, your dad as he tried to talk softly to Grandma on the phone about how bad the last fight had been and how much he wondered how long they could go on. Dad wandered in somewhere between shows and told them that lunch would be in a little while, asked if They had picked up their toys beforehand. Both went about it mechanically, throwing their toys into the box as they tidied up. Terry thought a lot about that fight that day, and it followed him like a ghost as he tried his best to outrun it. He thought about the way that she had accused his dad of not wanting the kids as he put his toys away. He thought about the way Dad had accused Mom of only wanting to work all the time as he ate his PB&J. He thought about the sound of that slap as he tried to concentrate on a video game or a comic book, and they chased him like a dog chases its tail all day long. He was still thinking about it when he went to bed that night, and when Dad turned off the light and told him that he loved him, he found his eyes weren't nearly tired enough to send him off to dreamland. He lay there in the dark, letting it pool around him as the moon sent runners of light in through the window. He was still awake when his mom came home, and he heard her look in on his father before going to the guest room and closing herself off. Terry closed his eyes, trying to seal in the hot tears that threatened to come leaking out. 10 was too young to realize that your comfortable life might be coming to an end. He shouldn't have such thoughts, but he'd watched Bobby Fitzroy go through it the year before. Now Bobby lived with his dad in New Mexico half the year, and his mom down the street the other half. Terry saw him at school still, most of the time, but he looked angry and confused. Bobby looked like he wasn't sure where he was a lot of the time, and he'd started getting into fights more often. Terry didn't want that for him or Laura, and as he tried to stop the tears, he heard himself whisper the words of a prayer or a curse. Take them away. Take them away before they can hurt us. I don't care who's going to take care of us, but I don't want them to share us. Please, 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 don't make me choose between them. I just want the fighting to stop. He drifted off as a light rain began to fall outside, a soft sound beneath it that, to his ears, sounded like hopping. Laura woke him up in the morning, shaking him so violently that he thought someone was attacking him. Terry! Terry, wake up! Mom and Dad are gone! Terry came groggily awake, still half in the dream that had held him all night. He was sitting in bed, watching the light stream under his bedroom door, broken only by something that came thumping up and down the hallway. It seemed to shake the house with each loud thump, and the longer he watched, the more curious he became. He'd gotten out of bed, but each step towards the door seemed to stretch his room like a funhouse. The door was suddenly miles away, and as he moved closer, he watched that thumping creature move back and forth in front of it. Just as he finally reached the door, it stopped in front of it and seemed to stare at him, as much as a shadow could stare. Its long black shade fell across him, and as the door came open, he was blinded by the light on the other side. Just as something began to materialize, Laura had started shaking him, and he'd never seen what it was. What'd you say? He said, rubbing at his eyes, not sure if he had heard her correctly. Mom and Dad are gone. The room is empty, and I can't find them. She was still in her PJs, and her hair was a puffy cloud hanging around her head. She was crying, and Terry could tell that she'd been up for a little bit. He wasn't too worried, though. Mom and Dad sometimes left them alone, but they usually left a note or something to explain. The more awake he came, the more Terry just assumed they had forgotten to get Easter stuff and just went out to pick some up while they were asleep. Maybe, he dared to think, they had gone to talk about what had happened yesterday, too. Did they leave a note? They probably just went out to buy Easter stuff for us. I don't know. I woke up and there was a noise in the living room. I'm really scared, Terry. Someone put decorations up in the hall, and I could see something big moving around in the living room. Come with me to check. I don't want to go alone. Terry sighed and climbed out of bed. Laura got like this sometimes, and until he proved to her that there was no boogeyman waiting to snatch her up, she wouldn't leave him alone. Best thing to do was get up and prove to her that there was nothing to be afraid of, so he could go back to bed until his parents got home. They never went anywhere together. They never seemed to do anything together other than sleep. So if they were both gone, he still held out hope that maybe they were talking things out. When he stepped out into the hallway, however, Terry thought something else might be going on. The walls were covered in Easter decorations. Crepe paper yellow chicks, cotton ball bunnies, yellow suns, multicolored Easter eggs, they were all stuck up to every surface and seemed to glare down at him, even with the hallway lights off. The only light he could see, in fact, was the warm, welcoming glow of the living room. As they watched, something did seem to be moving around in there, and Terry felt cold dread with every step he took. The sound of it moving reminded him of his dream. It was like hearing an adult hop around on all fours, and it was not an altogether comforting sound. As they came into the living room, Terry saw the decorations were in here as well. They made the living room look strange. The furniture looked similar, just like a lot of his friends' living rooms looked similar to his. But the canary yellow walls had been completely covered in decorations. They covered the windows and the door in the technicolored vibrance of a Lisa Frank notebook, and on the TV stand, where the old 30-inch TV sat, were a pair of baskets and a note that looked like someone had written it in crayon across the virgin poster board. "Happy Easter, Laura and Terry. We have a wonderful Easter egg hunt for you. Find 5 Easter eggs and then come to the kitchen for a lovely Easter breakfast," it said. Terry was hesitant. If his parents had planned this, then it was way out of left field. Laura, however, was delighted. Her earlier fears vanished, and she laughed as she grabbed the pink and green basket that was clearly meant for her. Terry reached for his own, and as he looked around, he could see plastic eggs hiding everywhere. Hiding was a bit of a stretch, he supposed. Some were hidden, but others were just tossed about, helter-skelter, as if a much younger child might be seeking them. "Come on, Terry! We only need 5 eggs!" They had their eggs quickly, the living room fairly bursting with them, and as they came to the kitchen, Terry found the source of the glumping noise. Seated at the table, its painted eyes smiling placidly, was someone who could only be his father in a large and intricate rabbit suit. The legs were so comically big that you would have to hop in order to move, and the body was clothed in a vest of many pastel colors. A pair of large buck teeth graced the face, and one ear hung jauntily at a crooked angle. At the stove was someone in a much more normal-sized chicken suit, the dimensions more suited for moving. They were cooking and clucking happily, and Terry could smell pancakes and butter as he and his sister approached the rabbit man. Laura was hesitant, but her smile made Terry think that she was still enchanted by the whole thing. "Congratulations, my little peeps," the rabbit man said, throwing his arms wide in excitement. "You've passed the first test. I hope you're ready for some breakfast." As he said it, a group of smaller chicks came bustling out, holding plates up so their mother could put pancakes on them. They all seemed to balk and cluck like real chickens as they bustled about, and as Terry and his sister sat down, they brought them large pancakes with jelly beans baked into them, a glass of soda and chocolate milk to wash it down with as well. Both the kids set to covering their cakes in syrup and laid in with relish as they scarfed down the tasty treat. As they ate, the chicks left, but the chicken and the rabbit seemed to watch them with interest. Terry found it a little off-putting, but he supposed it was the idea of having someone in a costume that interested in you. He was still pretty sure that this was just his mom and dad putting on for them. Maybe this was some of their cousins that acted as the chicks, and he felt only a little embarrassed by all of it. Terry was a little too old for all this, at least he felt so, but he could appreciate the effort that had gone into it. Maybe this was their way of making up for all the fighting lately. If so, Terry wasn't about to ruin this for Laura, who was probably certain that this was the Easter Bunny and his helpers. "So," said the bunny, bringing his gloved hands together, "are you ready for the next egg hunt?" "Yeah," Laura said, practically vibrating with all the sugar. "It's very simple," the rabbit man said. "Go collect 10 eggs each and get a wonderful prize." Laura hooted and was off like a shot, but Terry stayed for a moment. "So what's the prize?" he asked. "Are you guys giving us our baskets early or something?" The bunny man cocked his head a little, and the chicken made a low little cluck sound as she folded her hands in front of her. "Why, you've already got your basket, silly. If you want your next surprise, you better go find those eggs before your sister gets them all." Terry rolled his eyes. "Whatever you say, Mr. Easter Bunny," and went off to find some eggs. The second egg hunt took next to no time as well, but Terry discovered something strange when he left the living room to search the few other rooms in the house. Their 2-bedroom, 1-bath was full of plastic eggs. The bathroom, his sister's room, his parents' room, the living room, the coat closet, even his room had some eggs in it. He found 5 in the hallway, 5 more in the bathroom, but it appeared that he had taken his time. His sister was already biting the head off a large chocolate bunny when he came back to the kitchen. The Easter Bunny was looking on with frozen joy, but the chicken was gone. Terry figured his mother had needed to go to work, and it would just be them and the father rabbit for a while. Terry brought his eggs back and was presented with a large chocolate rabbit of his own. He hardly needed the sugar, but he found that he was wrapped up in the spirit of the season now, so he took a bite. After that, the day progressed in much the same way. They ate candy, they hunted eggs, and when lunch rolled around, the chicken and her chicks served them a lunch which turned out to be some kind of hamburger made out of gummy bear material with circus peanut buns. They hunted eggs all afternoon, winning chocolates and stuffed animals and other little trinkets. As they sat on the couch watching the Easter bunnies coming to town, Laura snuggled against her older brother as she tried to stay awake. Terry was trying to concentrate on the TV, but he felt like something was watching him. The prickling hairs on the back of his neck were tingling, and as he glanced around, he saw something large lean back into the kitchen. Their dad hadn't broken character all day, Mom either, and though Terry applauded their efforts, he was ready for some normalcy. Surely they wouldn't keep this up all weekend, would they? His mom would have to go back to work. Dad would have to go back to work. This was fun. It was the first day in a long time that his parents hadn't spent the day fighting, but Terry knew that tomorrow it would probably go back to business as usual. As he drifted off, he felt the shadow of the rabbit fall over him again, and shuddered as he remembered the dream from the night before. He woke up in his bed the next day, Laura shaking him awake again. "Terry! Terry!" "What, Laura? I want to sleep. I'm tired." He rolled over, pulling the covers over him as he slid his head beneath the pillow. He felt something small and plastic press against his cheek, and opened his eyes to find a fluorescent orange egg nestled beneath the pillow. "Okay, but you'll miss the egg hunt for breakfast," she said shyly, running out of the room as he sat up in bed. He could already see a few of the eggs hidden in his room, and a smile stretched his face as he grabbed for his basket. It seemed they were having another day of egg hunts. Their father was waiting for them in the kitchen, Mom in her hen costume cooking at the stove, and when he held his hands out, Laura dumped 5 eggs into the floppy mittens that covered them. "Great job, dear," he said, pulling a giggling Laura into a hug. "Mother hen, Laura would like her breakfast now." The hen bacocked loudly and set a plate down in front of Laura with scrambled eggs and bacon. Laura looked a little disappointed before biting into them and finding they were gummy bacon and eggs. The rabbit looked at Terry as he came stumbling into the kitchen, wiping sleep from his eyes and taking in the strange scene. His sister was laughing as she stretched the bacon like taffy, scarfing it down with gusto. Terry started to sit, but the rabbit man opened his hands, flapping them a little as if he expected payment. "Right," Terry said. "How many is it this morning?" "Only 5, the rabbit said cheerily, and Terry put his head back in the living room and quickly snapped up 5 of the plastic eggs. After he handed them to his father, he was rewarded with his own plate of gummy breakfast. "Not to ruin your theme here, Dad, but could I get some real eggs?" He heard the pan crash against the stove and turned to see Mother Hen glowering at him through the eye holes of her mask. Even through those painted-on happy eyes, Terry felt like he could feel the coals of her rage. Was she that committed to the role? "My bad, Mom. I didn't mean to insult you," he said, turning to eat. The Easter Bunny was giving her an equally hollow look, but turned back to Terry with his frozen regard. "Eat up, kids. We have another fun day of egg hunts ahead. We might even dye some eggs and make some crafts. Won't that be fun?" "Yeah!" Laura cried, gobbling up the rest of her breakfast. Terry agreed, leaning in and wondering how long this was going to go. They sat on the couch again that night, watching something called The Easter Chick. They had made masks after breakfast, both of them looking like chick faces made out of Easter grass and papier-mâché. Laura had worn hers all day, looking like a clucking hen as she went about her Easter egg hunting. She punctuated each loud squawk with a giggle, and the Easter Bunny seemed to like her enthusiasm. Terry, on the other hand, was glad they would only really be able to do this for one more day. Tomorrow would be Sunday, and Terry expected that after tomorrow, things would go back to normal. The egg hunts were fun, but they had needed 30 eggs to get dinner. Terry had been afraid that they couldn't find 60 eggs between them, but they had managed it after he remembered the one under his pillow and found a few more in his room. They'd been hunting eggs all day, and the longer it went on, the less certain Terry was that his father was in that costume. He had felt the rabbit man watching him on multiple occasions, peeking from doorways and skulking in the shadows, and it just didn't seem like the kind of thing his dad would do. Except for at meals, the chicken woman and her chicks were nowhere to be seen, and Terry wondered where they were going. They had to be disappearing through the back door, because they certainly weren't going out the front. Terry glanced at the window, still covered in decorations, and began to doubt that there was anything there but more wall. There had always been a window there. He knew that, but he was doubtful that there was a window or a door in the living room anymore. The movie went off, and the living room was bathed in the murky credit screen. Terry could feel the rabbit man watching him, the shadows from the kitchen not quite deep enough to hide him completely. He had been watching them for hours, and Terry prayed internally that he was dreaming. This wasn't real. His mind was playing tricks on him. He was being silly. Of course it was his mom and dad. Who else would be doing this? He yawned, but he shook his head. He didn't want to fall asleep. Then he'd wake up in his bed, and things like this would go on forever and ever. No, it'd be over tomorrow. His dad would wake them up Monday morning and ask how they had liked having the Easter Bunny over all weekend. He would wear that big old grin he always wore when he asked what Santa had brought them, and Terry would know that it had been him the whole time. As he tried to make his mind believe this, he must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, it was morning again. Terry woke up the next morning, but not with Laura shaking him awake. He woke up to the sound of Laura's frantic footsteps as she ran around the house. Terry's stomach grumbled, letting him know that it was later than he had thought it was. When he rolled out of bed, his feet came down on a plastic egg, and he saw that there were more of them in the floor. He scooped a few of them up and headed for the kitchen. As he came into the hallway, his sister nearly knocked him over as she hunted for eggs. She was wearing the mask still, her giggling gone as she moved about frantically. She was counting to herself, clearly thinking of eggs, and Terry shook his head as he moved towards the kitchen. The Easter Bunny and Mother Hen were still there, and the bunny spread his arms wide as he trumpeted, "Happy Easter!" He was humming "Here Comes Peter Cottontail" as Terry put the 10 eggs into his arms. The rabbit froze, seeming to count them with his skin, before dropping them onto the floor when some of them broke open to let their jelly beans spill out. "Oh dear, someone didn't read the note. It's 30 eggs for your special Easter breakfast, kiddo." Terry gasped, though it was twinged with cynicism. "Come on, Dad, this has gone a little far. I'm hungry. I want food." The rabbit sat staring at him, his frozen face now seeming more sinister than jolly. "Sorry, kiddo. I'm the Easter Bunny, not your dad. If you want your breakfast, it's 30 Easter eggs. It's a good one, too. Don't you want it?" Enough. This was fun at first, but it's becoming too much. I'm too old for this stuff anyway. Laura may like this, but I just want some. But he had reached for the stuffed rabbit head, and the hand that grabbed him was strong and thick and painful. "Oh dear, pal. Looks like somebody wants to be a party pooper. No breakfast for you until you get your 30 eggs. Now scoot, kiddo." The voice never rose, never became mean or monstrous, but when he flung Terry out of the kitchen, Terry realized that the guy in the suit couldn't possibly be his dad. He tossed him effortlessly with one arm, and when Terry hit the wall outside the kitchen door, he saw stars. The rabbit man just sat there after he'd returned his arm to the arm of the chair, his placid face grinning like a specter at the fallen boy. Laura came bustling in then, the front of her Easter dress stuffed with eggs. She upturned her bucket, spilling eggs across the floor, and then dumped the front of her dress and let her bounty cascade into the Easter bunny's lap. There must have been 60 eggs there, maybe more, and as the rabbit clapped his hands together, he reached behind the chair and took out a box that Terry was pretty sure hadn't been there before. Laura reached for it, her hands shaking as she held up the intricately wrapped package, and Terry heard her squeal as she pulled out a pair of onesie pajamas that looked like a chicken's body, minus the head, of course. The shadow of the mother hen fell over him, and when she pushed the door closed, Terry was left hurting as he leaned against the wall. For a split second, Terry thought about looking for some eggs. His stomach was grumbling, and he wanted something to eat, but he knew it would be more sugar and candy. They'd eaten nothing but sweets for 2 days, and Terry's stomach wasn't just grumbling for lack of food. He'd felt ready to throw up after dinner last night. Swedish fish the size of a carp in some kind of sugar sauce, and his body was crying out for real food. Instead of looking for eggs, Terry decided to limp back to his room and see if there was any food there. After a half an hour of looking, he discovered that the beef jerky and the sunflower seeds and even the Christmas popcorn bucket that his grandmother had gotten for him were gone. That seemed to lend more credence to the idea that this wasn't his house. But how could it be anywhere else? Something bounced off his closed door hard enough to rattle it, and Terry had just enough time and energy to throw his body against it before something battered it like a cannonball. It bounced off the frame, Terry pushing continuously as whatever it was tried to get in. He yelled at it to go away, told it to stop, but it just kept pummeling his door until it finally dropped against the wood, panting heavily. Terry wanted to see what it was, wanted to know what was happening out there, but instead he locked the door and shoved his desk against it. A plastic egg fell out from behind the desk, and as it broke open, Terry saw the jelly beans glistening on the floor. He was just so hungry, just hungry enough that even the sugary beans looked tasty as he wolfed them down greedily. He laid eyes on another, and suddenly he could see the fluorescent colors everywhere in his small room. He wanted to gut them and devour every last morsel, but something told him not to. They might have to last him for a little while, he reminded himself, taking them and dumping them on the desk, trying to see what kind of resources he had available. Turned out, the beans lasted for 2 days. No new eggs appeared, and Terry ate the beans sparingly as he tried to devise some plan to get out of here. If the front door was gone, he would only know after he tore down some of the decorations. What would the Easter bunny and the mother hen do if he started doing that? Would they stop him? Would they hurt him? The bump on the back of his head proved that they would hurt him. But how much? And what was all this? Why was he here? How had he gotten here? Surely this hadn't been because of his stupid Easter wish. He worried about Laura, too. God only knew what was happening to her. He still heard her running up and down the halls as she searched for eggs. Sometimes he wondered if she was the one banging on his door. It happened a few more times, the banging less frantic than the first time, and sometimes he imagined that he heard some weird clucking as whatever it was battered the door. Mother hen, maybe? Terry didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. Whether the food ran out or not, he would need water. On the second day, he devised a plan to get to the bathroom and get back to his room. He would creep out after Laura went to sleep, something she seemed to do after a set amount of time. Whatever was going on out there, his sister still slept. And that would give him an opportunity to get water and maybe some food. He would check to see if the rabbit man slept too, and if he did, maybe he could sneak some food from the kitchen. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After he heard nothing from the house for what he judged to be about an hour, Terry shoved the desk out of his way and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the living room, as the TV showed nothing but snow. Whatever tonight's feature presentation had been, it was over now. Terry crept like a ghost from his bedroom and made his way down the hallway. His throat was dry, his belly grumbling, but he made himself be quiet. If the rabbit man or the chicken woman or even Laura caught him, it would be very bad for him. Each step felt like 1,000 miles, and each step made him expect to be devoured by a large and angry beast as his foot came down on the carpet. When his foot struck something, he jumped back in surprise, but when it groaned in pain, he looked down to see that he had stumbled over the last thing he expected to find. It was one of the peeps, but it was lying on the floor, curled into a ball. It was shaking and groaning, and as he came a little closer, it turned its head and said his name. It lifted its wing and tried to touch its face, but it seemed to panic when it touched its throat and didn't find what it expected. It shook its head, saying his name again as it sobbed in pain and fear, and that's when Terry understood. It was Laura. They had turned his sister into one of them somehow. Terry didn't remember crying, but when Laura lifted a wing up to his face, he saw tears on her feathers. He pulled her to him, wanting to comfort her to be sure, but he didn't know how. This was all his fault. He just wanted something better than his parents always fighting and his sister always scared. He just wanted a family that loved each other. When he picked her up, he found her surprisingly light. He took her to the living room, intending to discover if there was a door there or not. He laid her on the couch, Laura seeming to bask in the glow of the TV, as he went to work. The crate paper and construction paper came down in harsh gasps as Terry tore it. The walls were covered in them, thick as spider web, and as they came down, Terry felt almost hopeless, as only the walls greeted him. There was no door, no window, no escape from this place. Terry slammed his small fist against the wall in impotent rage. They had trapped him. The only way out was through the damned rabbit and his clucking wife. And Terry doubted that they could get past them, even if his sister was conscious. Even less so if he had to carry her. Lose something, kiddo? Terry spun in a blind panic, and there was the Easter Bunny. He looked different now, slightly smaller, and when he moved, Terry realized why. His legs moved like they should have, galumphing along like a rabbit's would. He was minus his vest, and his face was far too expressive for a normal creature. He looked like the costume he had worn, but he was just too real to be believed. He was like a prop in a movie. The most genuine thing Terry had ever seen. He held out his hand, and a delicate blue egg appeared. Even at 10, it was the most beautiful thing Terry had ever seen. It was Fabergé, looking painstakingly painted, and in the front was a little window. Inside the window, Terry could see a little house with little trees in the front yard. He didn't need a closer look to see that it was his house and guessed the egg's purpose. I was worried you had died in there, kiddo, and now you're trying to leave before the game's over. Not very sportsmanlike of you. Terry looked at the egg, wanting it more than anything in his entire life, but knowing he'd probably never have it. Let's play a game, then. You find one more egg, and you can go free. Find my special egg in 24 hours, and you can go. Fail, and you come with me. Terry took a step forward, wanting to simply snatch the egg, but as the rabbit closed his fist around it, Terry saw it was gone when he opened it again. Where's that? Where would you take me? Terry asked, not trusting the rabbit man for a second. "Same place I take all the kids who wish for something better. You head home with me, join the peeps, lay the eggs I leave for kids who've earned them, and serve me for all time." Terry wanted to deny him, wanted to yell some of the unique swears the older kids used at school, but he knew that this might be his only chance. He was screwed either way, so what did it really matter? "Deal," Terry said, and suddenly every light in the house came on, bathing the space in light. The Easter Bunny was gone, but Terry didn't need him anymore. It took him 2 hours to destroy the living room, but he found no egg. He ripped foam out of the couch, moving his sister to a pallet on the floor as he tore it to pieces. He smashed the TV. He tried to pull up the carpet before realizing the futility, and after 2 hours he had nothing to show for it but a torn fingernail and a dull throbbing in his hand. He went room to room, tearing everything to pieces as he looked for the egg. All the normal eggs were gone now, and Terry was glad that they weren't there to muddy the waters. He tore open his parents' mattress. He pulled the drawers out of their dresser. He ripped his sister's stuffed animals open. He tore his clothes from the closet and piled them on the floor. He smashed his fish tank and sifted through the rocks. He pulled everything out of both closets, but after hours of searching, he couldn't find it. He held back his tears with every room that passed, and as he looked into the bathroom, he knew it had to be here. He had left the rooms of the house in ruins, and this was the last place it could be. He tore every towel out of the towel closet, but no egg. He emptied the hamper, but no egg. He took the tank lid off the toilet, and when he found no egg, he broke it on the toilet, leaving it gushing water. Terry looked everywhere, but as it came to pass that there was still no egg, he fell to his knees and cried amidst the seeping water. He had failed. He couldn't find it. Now he and Laura would be trapped in the service of this Easter Bunny, made to lay eggs and serve his food forever. His hands bled, his knees hurt, and as he cried, the tears stung the cuts on his cheek. Terry had wanted to go home. He just wanted this all to end. And when someone enveloped him in a hug, he flinched hard enough to knock himself into the wet floor. He looked up to see Laura standing over him, tears streaming down her eyes as she watched her big brother fall to pieces. "I'm sorry, Laura. I'm sorry. I can't save you. This is all my fault. I wished for this. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. But she put a wing against his mouth and shook her head. She reached out with her other, the wing still possessing some stubby fingers amidst the feathers, and held out the egg that he'd been searching for. Terry's jaw fell open. The bunny had hidden it in the one place he knew Terry would never look, with Laura. The knowledge made him feel small, but as he shook the egg, he heard something rattling inside of it. He tilted it so that the picture window was face down, and a large old-fashioned key fell into his palm. He took it back to the living room, looking at the blank wall again until he found what he was looking for, a keyhole in that perfectly flat wall. He put it in and twisted, the door opening onto the mirror of the living room he stood in, minus the utter ruin that Terry had created while on his last egg hunt. He reached back for Laura, but she took a step away and shook her head. "Come on," he said, not understanding. "We don't have to stay." Laura didn't seem capable of real speech, but she took her wings and tapped them on her chest, as if to emphasize that she couldn't go back like this. It doesn't matter. Mom and Dad will love you whatever you look like. Maybe you'll turn back if you come back. Come on, Laura, you've got to come back." Laura shook her strange head, still covered by the papier-mâché mask she had made. Terry wondered what she looked like beneath it, but having seen the peeps as they served them meals, he thought he might be able to guess. As she went back to the kitchen, he saw the mother hen put a protective arm around her, leading her into whatever lay beyond that room. She only looked back once, and Terry only waited until she was out of sight to step through the door. "I'll come back for you somehow," he whispered, before falling into his own living room and passing out from exhaustion and malnutrition. That was where his parents found him when they came home an hour later. They'd been searching for him for 4 days and had just come from a press conference where they begged the kidnappers to bring their children back. His mother had screamed when she'd found him lying there, and they had rushed him to the ER. He'd been unconscious for about a day, but when Terry came to, he had told them about what had happened. He could tell they didn't believe him, thinking he'd been drugged or was just traumatized, but the search continued for Laura for the next 2 years. Terry told them who had taken her, but no one seemed to think the actual Easter Bunny had kidnapped 2 kids and then just let one of them go. Time went on, and after a dozen or so therapists and psychologists told Terry that his mind had misremembered a tragic childhood event, he started to believe it himself. He tried his best to forget about Mother Hen, the Easter Bunny, and his poor lost sister, but his dreams brought him back to that weekend often. In the dreams, the Easter Bunny chased him through the house, a nightmarish maze of halls and corridors that only ended when the giant rabbit finally came down on top of him, crushing him flat. His wife became fairly used to her husband waking up crying in the night, but she tried her best to help him through it. Despite everyone assuring him that it had never happened, Terry kept the egg on his desk, a reminder of his lost sister. Terry was 32 the next time he thought about Laura. His daughters were opening their Easter baskets as Terry and Mary looked on with smiles. Terry had to bury a shudder as he watched them crack open plastic eggs, and he reminded himself that all that had been his mind trying to make a traumatic experience more palatable. Candace and Schuler were not he and Laura. They would never have to hunt eggs through a nightmare house as they slowly became chickens. That was a fantasy, and one that was over. Schuler looked confused for a moment, holding up a very white egg as she read something printed on it. "Daddy, who's Aunt Laura?" Terry's breath hung in his throat, but Candace cut off any answer that he might have given. "I got one too. I don't think I've ever met her." Terry came slowly towards them, reaching out to Schuler as he asked to see. Printed in black ink on the plastic egg, the insides full of Technicolor jelly beans that spilled out as he gripped it much too hard, was something that brought Terry to his knees. He spent the rest of Easter in the ER, after fainting over with the egg still in his hand, his girls all very worried about him. On the egg were the words, "Happy Easter from your Aunt Laura." I was not at fault here. I don't understand why the universe has decided that I should suffer. As I lay here and listen to his throaty, phlegm-filled breathing, I consider again the idea that ending it might be best. It wasn't my fault. I didn't cause what happened to him. He should have just left me alone. Now I'm the one who must suffer his company, maybe for the rest of my life. The day had started with a hard slap of rocks against my window, and I loosed a loud sigh as I thrust the covers away from me. Every morning. Every goddamn morning. I hadn't had to buy an alarm clock since I moved in, so I suppose that was something. As another handful of stones cascaded against the window, I swung angrily out of bed and shifted the curtains open. I did not open the window right away. You only made that mistake once. The pudgy man-child on the sidewalk had just reared back to throw another handful when he saw the window open and smiled happily. That smile showed me every inch of his yellow teeth, his spotted gums, and the spit that covered his half-rotten teeth in a sheen of translucence. He was dressed in his usual attire, and I imagined I could smell him from 2 floors up. He wore ratty Chuck Taylor sneakers, cargo shorts in February that likely hadn't been washed since his mother had bought them from JCPenney, a ratty black trench coat that covered his grease-stained t-shirt depicting a busty anime girl who seemed overjoyed to be stretched across his voluptuous C-cup breasts, and a wispy beard that made his face look dirtier somehow, and the battered black fedora that capped it all off. This is what he had worn, or some iteration of it, every day since we had first met 2 years ago, and I shook my head as he waved a pudgy hand at me. "Good morning, m'lady." He knew my name. I'd told it to him 1,000 times, but he always insisted on calling me m'lady.
Kenneth, what the hell do you want?
I was grumpy about being woken up, and sour about Kenneth being the first person I saw 9 mornings out of 10. "Well, I just thought that since we worked today, I'd offer to walk you. We're on the same shift again, so just seems like you might appreciate the company." I sighed. I would have appreciated the company. Any company but Kenneth's.
I'm gonna be a minute, Kenneth. A long minute, so feel free to just go on without me.
I can wait for you. I'll be right here when you get done. When you're ready. Unless you'd rather I wait inside. He snorted through a partially clogged nose. I saw the gleam that came into his piggy eyes and shuddered.
I'd rather you went on without me, Kenneth, but since there's nothing I can do to stop you from waiting, I suppose you can just wait on the front porch.
I closed the window then, blocking him out and pulling the curtains closed, as I went to get ready for work. Every day, every goddamn day. I've been living in this townhouse for the last 2 years, and I should have known that the rent was too good to be true. The lady who showed me the house was very complimentary about the neighborhood. She talked about the convenient garbage pickup, the cost-effective water measures she had installed, the proximity to restaurants in downtown, and all at a cost that was nearly half of the other rentals in the area. I had been attending college at the time, the college being about 3 blocks from my apartment, and it had sounded like a real sweetheart deal. I was moving my stuff the first time I met Kenneth. I say met, but I smelled him before I saw him. Have you ever been next to someone on the subway who maybe doesn't shower regularly? The kind of person who covers it up with body sprays instead of just washing their clothes and wearing deodorant. The kind of person you don't really want to stand too close to because their clothes look like they might get grease on yours if they brush up against you. That was what I was assaulted by as this mountain of a man came wandering over to introduce himself. He was dressed in cargo shorts and a t-shirt that day, the July heat too much for even his trench coat to handle, with a pair of sandals that put his yellow toenails on display. I was carrying a box of books inside when I heard him greet me by name. That should have been my first indication that something was afoot. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Kenneth. My mom said I had a new tenant, but she failed to mention how beautiful she was. Would you like some help?" I had thanked him, but Kenneth's idea of helping seemed to entail watching me move boxes while he talked my ear off about video games, anime, and fantasy roleplay. He was aghast that a girl as worldly as me, whatever that was supposed to mean, had never seen an anime. I admitted that I had watched some Sailor Moon when I was in elementary school, mostly because it was on when I got home. He scoffed at that, though, and waved a pudgy hand at the mention of what he called girly anime. The fact that I didn't play D&D or video games was also a subject he wished to remedy. Thankfully, I had moved all my stuff in by the time he started talking about the 3rd or 4th game franchise, of which he was a super fan, and I thanked him for his help.
I'm going inside to unpack now, so I'll see you.
"Ooh, I can help you unpack if you like." I'd been standing in the doorway when he said it, the front door the only thing that lay between him and I. The look that crossed his face when he offered to help me unpack was akin to a cat left to guard a mouse. I could just picture his grubby man-child fingers pawing through my clothes, finding some reason to stumble across my underwear, pressing my shirts to his pug nose, and had to stifle a full-body shudder.
On second thought, I'm pretty tired, Kenneth. I think I'm going to rest and unpack tomorrow. Have a good night.
He started to protest, but I closed the door on him and locked the deadbolt. The door had 3 locks, a twist lock, the deadbolt, and the top chain. I engaged all of them before turning around to make something to eat. I had already decided that I would unpack before going to bed today, leaving Kenneth with no excuse to go upstairs and touch any of my things. His annoyance had become creepy pretty quick, and I did not want him hanging around any more than I could help. I had just gotten to the entryway to the small kitchen when I heard an unsettling noise from the front door. I turned and found the doorknob twisting a little, as whoever was on the other side tried to quietly open my door. I thought about seeing who it was, but my fear had a firm grip on me. Home is where you're supposed to feel safest, and that turning knob negated any safeness I might have felt. I couldn't prove it was Kenneth, but I couldn't prove it wasn't. The turning stopped after a few seconds, and I made a mental note to get a chain for the back door, too. The first 6 months were probably the least eventful. I enjoyed my newfound freedom of having my own space, but I definitely noticed some of the strangeness in the house. I would come home to find things moved or find things missing, and I suspected that Kenneth had been in while I was gone. More than once I would catch a whiff of Axe body spray upstairs, a smudge on something that looked like a fingerprint, or just something moved that shouldn't have been. Kenneth came over to hang out a lot, and I quickly got tired of having him around. He was always overly friendly, almost fawningly so, and I began to suspect that he had a crush on me. He brought over anime or his Xbox, and I have spent many evenings reading subtitles or watching him finish some level on a game. He was annoying, but I felt that he was ultimately pretty harmless, and the movies he brought over were sometimes pretty cool. He seemed harmless, if not a little clingy. Anytime I would start to feel the least bit comfortable around him, though, I remembered that look on the doorstep and began to rethink. I gave his mother a key the first time I changed the locks, telling her I suspected an old tenant was using the key to come and go as they pleased. After I found the chain off the back door, something I was zealous about keeping chained at all times, I didn't bother giving her a key. After that, the intrusions stopped. Then, COVID had happened. The city did the lockdown thing, and suddenly all the classes were online, all the functions were canceled, and I was spending more time than usual inside my apartment. During this time, unfortunately, my grades began to suffer. Some people can absolutely take classes online and do fine, but I'm not one of those people. I was one of those popular girls in high school who liked to bask in a place's environment and social structure. Suddenly, having professors that I couldn't talk to face-to-face was hurting my grades. Suddenly, not having peers to talk to review notes with, and to bounce ideas off of was hurting me. And as my grades suffered, the school threatened to take away my grant. The grant was how I paid for housing, so I doubled down and tried to bring them up again. I studied long hours, watched tutorials on YouTube, and read anything that I could find on the subject matter, but nothing seemed to help. Kenneth also did not help with this particular problem. Despite the order to wear masks and social distance, Kenneth was always trying to come over and hang out like he used to. He wasn't in school, all his friends were already online, and neither he or his mother thought this was more than the flu. I don't know how many times I would look through the peephole and find him maskless on my front porch with an anime box set of something or his Xbox waiting for me to hang out. I tried to be nice to him, but as my grades suffered, so did my mental health, and I started ignoring him after a while. Then, after a horrible semester, my grant was cut, and I was left waiting to re-up next year. That's how we'd come to our current predicament, me working and Kenneth being paid to hang out with me. I came out the front door 45 minutes later to find him sitting on my porch swing, his phone in his hand, and his rocking making the chains grind together annoyingly.
Is that really what you're wearing to work?
It's not like they care. It's Walmart. As long as you show up, they don't care what you have on. He had a point, but I still tried to tune him out as we walked to work together. I had started working at Walmart after my savings started to dwindle. My landlord, Kenneth's mother, cut my rent a little, because of all this pandemic nonsense, she said, with a little scoff. However, it still only floated me another month or so before I needed to get a job. Walmart was hiring, and they needed warm bodies. Kenneth didn't work there right away, but after hearing that I had started working there, he was soon applying for a job as well. Charles, one of my assistant managers, was a gaming buddy of his, and I assumed the source of my constant stock shifts with Kenneth. It was a real toss-up, which one of them I hated more these days. Kenneth was unnaturally quiet on the way to work today. His face had that look that let me know he was thinking about something very hard, and I feared that he would ask me out again. He had asked me out about once a month since I moved in, and I had just started ignoring him, despite his mother's pressure. I got the feeling that she was getting worried about him not leaving the nest, and she hoped that a nice girlfriend would be enough of a mother stand-in to help him get out of her basement and into mine. Sorry, Mama Kenneth, but that dog wasn't hunting in these woods. She could find some other girl to pawn her precious angel off onto. So, m'lady, he said, finally finding his courage, you may have noticed that, Valentine's Day is tomorrow. I rolled my eyes at him theatrically.
It had somehow escaped me after unloading a metric ton of Valentine's Day candy and toys over the past month, Kenneth. But thanks for bringing it to my attention.
Well, I was just wondering if you'd like to be my Valentine this year and go on a date with me tomorrow. I sighed. Every year with this guy.
No, Kenneth. For the 1000th time, no.
Kenneth's face got that look about it that small children get when you tell them no. But why? Don't tell me you already have a date.
Nope, sure don't. I intend to stay in on Valentine's Day since I have the night off.
Well, that's fine. We don't have to go out or anything. We can stay in and rent a movie and maybe cuddle on the couch. And I rounded on him then, my frustration and lack of patience getting the better of me, as I erupted liquid hate all over this yipping puppy of a man.
No, Kenneth, I have told you no 1,000 times, and the answer will always be no. I don't want to date you. I hardly want to be your friend most days. And the thought of you sitting next to me on the couch gives me hives. Move on!
Kenneth just stood there, his face transitioning between barely contained tears and barely contained rage. His mouth seemed like it wanted to say something, but his brain seemed to be holding it at bay. He looked like he was trying to chew himself from the inside out, and the tears seemed to win out in the end. His eyes began to flood with impotent water, the flood falling to his t-shirt as he turned and ran back towards home. He looked like one of those anime characters he loved so much as he fled from his spurning, and I guessed later that might have been his intention. I let him go, making sure he rounded the corner before turning to head to work. Some of us still had bills to pay. I thought that maybe Kenneth would have learned a little something after my outburst, but he clearly hadn't. I got home very late that night to find him sitting on my porch with a heart-shaped box of chocolates. "M'lady," he wheezed, rising ponderously from the seat, "you've returned to home at long last." The look on my face should have told him everything he needed to know about how glad I was to see him. I brushed snow off the shoulder of my jacket and wondered how long he'd been sitting there waiting for me. It had been chilly when I'd gotten to work, but not really uncomfortably so. That had changed quickly over the last 8 hours, and all anyone at work could talk about was the freezing blizzard that was rolling in tonight. The old-timers were saying that the Weather Channel called for 3 feet of snow overnight, and it had already started to powder as I'd left at 10. I had walked back home with only the streetlights to keep me company, a welcome change from the usual yarking in my ear of Kenneth. Now, it seemed, I would have to get loud with him all over again.
Yeah, you know why I had to stay so late? It was you. You didn't show up for work, so I had to do your job and my job tonight. I had to stock 2 departments in 8 hours, and then, when I couldn't get it done, I had to stay an extra 4 hours and finish your work.
He backed away, holding up the box of chocolates like it was a shield, clearly not receiving the greeting he had hoped for. "Yeah, I kinda had a little freak out when you said you wouldn't be my girlfriend, but I realized that once you had the chance to calm down, you'd come to your senses. And we could plan our date for tomorrow. Here, I got you these chocolates. It's kinda late to make a reservation for anywhere, but, He stopped talking when I slapped the box out of his hand, the half-eaten box scattering across my porch.
No, Kenneth, I will not date you. I will not walk with you to work. I'm through pretending to be your friend. Go away and leave me alone. Take a hint, you insufferable man-child. I don't like you, and I don't want to hang out with you.
I walked to the door and keyed it open, blocking it so he couldn't just follow me in. When I turned back to look at him, though, I was a little worried about doing this on the porch. Kenneth was breathing heavily, and I thought for a moment that he might be crying. The breathing was filled with rage, though, and I was suddenly very aware that I was a 5'2" woman yelling at a man who was nearly 6 feet tall and weighed about twice my weight. I I suddenly needed to get in the house in a very short amount of time. I needed the door between Kenneth and I. I needed to call his mother, if not the police, and explain to her that her son was on the verge of a restraining order. "What the hell is your problem?" Kenneth bellowed, and I half closed the door as he turned to let his spittle of rage fly at me. "I'm nice to you. I try to be your friend. I bring you gifts. I do everything that a boyfriend does, and you still won't date me. That's not fair. You're supposed to love me. You're supposed to fall in love with me because I do all the things that girls like. I even went and bought the box set of Sailor Moon so we could just sit and watch it together, since I know you like that girly crap." He took a step towards me, and I slammed the door in his face. I had just engaged the deadbolt when he twisted the knob and slammed his full weight against the door, bellowing like a wounded animal.
"Go home, Kenneth. Don't bother me anymore, or I will call the police."
He banged on the door a while longer, but I ignored him. When I had finished making myself a bowl of chili, I found that he had stopped pounding on the door. I ate my food, showered, got my clothes ready for tomorrow. On the off chance that we didn't get 3 feet of snow, I would need to go to work tomorrow and deal with Kenneth. He would likely be waiting for me as always, smiling his butter-toothed grin and waiting like an excited puppy for me to come out and play. I was snug in my bed, preparing to sleep, when I heard the music. The music was soft, romantic, and I thought for a moment that it might be something by John Legend. I could hear it coming from right below my window, and I flipped the covers back angrily as I went to have a look. Sure enough, it was Kenneth. He was parked in the snow, a large silver boombox in his hand, and as he lifted it up, bad 80s movie style, I opened the window. We made eye contact, his eyes filled with earnest emotion, and mine filled with nothing but puppy-kicking rage. I opened the window, chill scraping across me.
"Go home, Kenneth."
"No," Kenneth said. "Not until you agree to date me."
"You're going to freeze out there."
"Then let me in and keep me warm," he said, unable to keep that grin off his face. I just closed the window on him. He'd get cold and go home eventually. The music stopped about an hour later, and I guessed that his batteries had run dry after all that continuous playing. The next morning, I woke up to a sea of white. The snow hadn't been 3 feet deep. The snow had been 5 feet deep, and it spilled over onto my porch when I opened my door that morning. The wind was made of frozen razor blades, the power holding but flickering a little now and then, and I called work to see if I had to be there today. They said that they would be closed for the next few days. They told me to stay safe, and I decided to settle in for a well-deserved couple of days off. I had expected Kenneth to bother me since I was now trapped in my house, but he never came around. I got to enjoy a nice breakfast, and even got to watch some TV, before I was reminded that Kenneth existed at all. The knock came as the laugh track played on my 3rd episode of Friends, and I sighed as I tied my bathrobe so as not to give him any ideas. He would want to come in, pretending like we'd never had a fight yesterday at all, and I would likely have to yell at him again. I was surprised to see that it was Kenneth's mom, Janet, and not her portly man-child when I opened the door. "Hey there," she said, shivering on my porch as she pulled the scarf around her mouth. "I was just wondering if Kenneth was over here." Janet is, quite frankly, the sweetest woman I've ever met. In the 2 years I've been here, she's tirelessly fixed anything that's wrong in the townhouse, brought over food for things like 4th of July or Thanksgiving, and even apologized for Kenneth on more than one occasion. She's like Cartman's mom from South Park. She was a lovely woman, and while aware that her son was a nightmare, there was only so much she could do besides love him.
"Not since last night, ma'am."
"Oh dear. Well, I do hope he's okay. He said you two had a little fight yesterday, and he was coming over to try to make up." I gritted my teeth hard enough to hear them creak, but I held in the rage I was feeling so I didn't cook this nice, oblivious lady alive. "Well, if you see him, tell him I was worried, okay?" As she left, I saw that someone had shoveled the sidewalk, and she had made a little path to my door. That was nice of them, but it seemed I really didn't have anywhere to go. The city was buried under snow and basically shut down. It appeared I could be inside for a while, and I decided to settle in and enjoy my time off. The weirdness didn't start till almost sundown. I was making dinner when I noticed a smell hanging around the apartment. I looked around, wondering if I'd forgotten to take the trash out or something. It was a wet smell, with an underlying odor of cologne.
It was like someone had tried to cover a mess with deodorizer, and the longer I stood cooking at the stove, the more my head began to ache. The longer I stayed in the miasma, the worse the smell got, and the stir-fry I was making started to swim a little as I cooked it. I ended up eating it a little underdone as I fled the kitchen to the living room. As the swinging door opened, I stopped and basted in the swampy tang of smells from the living room and the kitchen. In the kitchen, it had smelled like funk. In the living room, it smelled like the inverse. Someone had been in my house. Of that I had no doubt. The smell of spray cologne was strong in here, like a pungent wall that surrounded the couch. And as I sat, I could feel something flaking beneath me. It was like sitting in a seat behind a small child, and as I looked, I could see chip crumbs sticking to my pajama pants. They were orange and smelled strongly of Doritos. I set my bowl down as I stood and walked through the house. I could see smudges around the room, especially on my figurines and some of my pictures. Someone with large, greasy fingers had been touching my things, and when I moved past the end of the table near the door, I took up the keychain with the mace on it. The doors were deadbolted, and though I didn't know how Kenneth had gotten in my house, I was certain that he was the source of this. If he thought he could hang out in my house and violate my privacy just to get his rocks off, he had another thing coming. My food was cold by the time I got done, triple-checking every room in my apartment just to be sure. There was nowhere he could have stayed hidden from me, not someone his size, and after spraying some Febreze around, I took my food up to my room and just ate it cold. I felt uncomfortable in the open down there, and as the snow blew and the wind howled, I sat on my bed and listened. At some point, I fell asleep, curling up in my bed as I listened to the silent house around me. When I came to, the lights were off in my room, and the curtains were thrown open to reveal a crystalline moon peeking in. The room was as quiet as the house, but I was aware of a heavy, wet sound as I came awake. It sounded like a dog, one that's been left out in the heat, and I scanned around to find the source of that heavy breathing. My eyes cast around, looking for the noise, and finally settled on a large black spot in the corner of the room. The darkness there was deep, the pitted murk blighted by a pair of small ovals that seemed to reflect the moon. The breathing was coming from there, and as it got heavier, the darkness seemed to shift unnervingly, like someone lurking in the gloom, trying not to be noticed. "M'lady," someone almost whispered, and I was up and across the room in a matter of seconds. I snapped the lights on, hands reaching for anything I could find to defend myself with. I expected to see him much too close as the lights came on. I expected him to bury me under his weight, pushing me down and feeling his hands as he tried to kiss me, to touch me. I gripped the ceramic vase as the lights came on, preparing to swing it and shatter it against his head as he... There was nothing. The lights came on and revealed nothing but an empty room with an anxious girl looking crazily around for an attacker who wasn't there. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat up and argued with myself until the sun came up. I knew what I had seen. I had seen Kenneth in the corner, heard the same deep, watery breathing I had heard 1,000 times. But I couldn't have seen him. Kenneth was a large and stocky fellow. There was no way he could have gotten away in the split second between the lights being off and the lights being on. This wasn't someone who could squeeze under my bed in a split second or slip into my closet without notice. Kenneth often got winded on walks to work, and the idea that he could quickly get out of my sight was laughable at best. Still, he had been there. That whole next day, I saw signs of someone having been in my house. It started as I finally got up for the day. As I came downstairs, I smelled something getting ready to burn in the kitchen. I pulled my robe around myself and quickly pushed into the cloud of smoke that awaited me. On the stove, smoke billowing up, was one of my good pans. I turned the stove off, jerking my hand away as I grabbed the handle of the pan. It was broiling. The burner turned all the way up, and I grabbed an oven mitt and took the pan off the stove. It wasn't until I put it in the sink that I saw a single blackened pancake at the bottom. A heart-shaped pancake. I was scraping the grit from the bottom of the pan when I suddenly heard an all-too-familiar theme song from the living room. The TV had been off when I got up. The lights dimmed to a soft glow. From under the swinging door, I could hear the TV blaring, and the pulse of bright lights clicked up to the max. I pushed in, expecting to find Kenneth parked on my couch, waiting for me with his big serial killer grin and his excuse of how, oh, well, the door was open, so he'd come right on in. But there was no one in the living room when I came through the door. There was, however, an indent in my couch, roughly the size of a large someone's backside. I searched the apartment again, already knowing what I would find, but needing the reassurance that I would find it. There was no one, just me, in my apartment. I turned off the TV and cleaned up the mess, waiting till 9 before calling my landlord, wanting to hear her tell me that Kenneth had come home. I wanted her to answer the phone and hear Kenneth in the background as he loudly whined for food or money or something. I wanted the confirmation that he was home, but I also feared it, because if he was home, then what the hell was going on around here? She answered on the 4th ring. Hello? Hello? Did you find him? Please say you found my baby. I sighed, my hopes shattered.
No, ma'am. I was just calling to see if he had turned up.
I could hear her sob before telling me that no one had seen him and how worried she was about him, and to please call if I heard anything. I got dressed and decided to sit on the porch for a while, the house suddenly feeling too small for me. I thought I heard some rustling as I slid out of my pajamas and into some real clothes, but I did my best to ignore it as I made some tea and stepped out into the frigid air. The smoke from my tea plumed up as I sat on the swing that Kenneth had occupied yesterday, letting the cold air clear my head as I tried to read the book I had brought with me. The longer I sat, my eyes roving over the winter wonderland in my own yard, the harder it became to maintain my anxiety. I was making too much out of this. Surely I had been imagining things, or a power surge caused by the weather had turned my TV on, or I'd been sleepwalking or something. The more I let the cold wash over me, the more I assured myself that I was just being silly. As noon came and went, the cold beginning to abate and the snow starting to soften, I went back inside. My stomach was growling for some lunch, but the icy chill from outside made me long for a shower first. I had all but forgotten about my trepidation and anxiety, and simply wanted to be warm and snuggly as I enjoyed the rest of my afternoon. I would have a shower, put on some nice pajamas, make the stew I had set the ingredients out for in the fridge, and then head to bed after a nice evening spent at rest. As the warm water cascaded over my skin, I felt the cold dissipate and the leftover anxiety melting away. The shower had always been my safe place, my relaxation zone, and standing beneath the warm deluge made me feel a sense of peace that I'd been missing before the communion with nature. I washed my hair, lathering myself up, and just stood under the water as the soap and my worries slid down the drain. At least, I did, before I felt someone touch my hair. I have long blonde hair, the kind that falls to about the small of my back and must be meticulously maintained so it doesn't look trashy. If I'm sitting on the couch watching TV, there's probably a brush in my hand, and my hair is flipped over my shoulder. I've always been sensitive about my hair, and I don't let people touch it very often. So when someone ran their fingers through my long blonde mass of wet hair, my eyes snapped open, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I had felt the slight tug as 2 or 3 thick fingers slid down and parted the wet locks. I slipped as I stumbled forward, catching myself on the wall before I fell and hurt myself. Through the soupy curtain of foam, I looked around for the source of the touch, expecting to see him. I expected to see a bulbous shape leering at me from behind the curtain, but as I swiped the tangled muck out of my eyes, I was greeted with an empty bathroom. I came shakily out of the shower, hands trembling as I reached for my towel. I was shaken badly. I knew what I had felt. Enough men had tried to touch my hair for me to know what it felt like, and I couldn't trick myself into believing I'd just been imagining things. As I slid back into my clothes, the fog still thick around me, I was met with something even less easy to overlook. Written in the steam on the mirror, the lines reflecting my own horrified face back at me, was the word, "Milady." I ran, half-dressed from the bathroom, and slipped on the surprise waiting for me in the hall. I went down hard on my backside, bruising my tailbone. The floor was covered with something that my wet feet found slippery, and now that I was on eye level with the floor, I could see them. They had been scattered artfully, leading towards my door in a line of red blotches. The rose petals would have been romantic on any other occasion. At the moment, they left me breathless as I leaned against the wall,
watching the door creak slowly open. Behind it, the light in my room dimmed. I could see a thick, softly shadowed form, his eyes gleaming as his tongue slid over his thick porcine lips. I vaguely remember tripping down half the stairs, bruising my legs as I ran for the door. I remember grabbing my phone from the end table by the door, the charging cord coming free as I ran for the porch. I remember talking to the operator, my teeth chattering as I shivered on the porch. My hands and feet were numb, my hair getting stiff from the cold, when the lights lit the icy yard. The sun had started to melt the snow, even as it set behind the nearby houses. The lights on the snow looked odd, almost ethereal, and as they approached, I was thankful when someone threw a blanket over me. One of the officers stayed to take my statement, as the others searched the house. As I told him what had happened, I heard the snow crunch as my landlady came over to see what all the fuss was about. The police came from inside a moment later, shaking their heads and telling me they hadn't found anything. Someone was definitely in there, though. There were rose petals all over your bed and a box of chocolates sitting in the center. Someone had planned quite a romantic surprise for you, though I'm guessing the feeling wasn't mutual. I shook my head and started to tell them about Kenneth's ambush on my porch the night before. But that was when I saw him again. The snow had melted some, and I could see him hunched by the fence line. He was staying still, trying not to be noticed, but I had seen him. His ridiculous black trench coat was a dead giveaway, and I screamed as I pointed at him. His mother looked over my shoulder, pushing me aside as she ran towards her son. I grabbed the rail as I watched her go, the cops chasing after her, wondering why he hadn't moved. The jig was up. We could see him. Why was he just sitting there? When his mother started screaming, and the police officer started calling for an ambulance, I knew something was wrong. That was 2 days ago. He was dead, of course. He had frozen to death, waiting for me to invite him inside. They found the boombox sitting around his feet, frozen to the ground. His coat had been frozen to the back of the fence, and he had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. His mother, of course, was quick to blame me. Why hadn't I let him inside? Why hadn't I called her? And on until the police had finally taken her away. I had taken a few things and gone to stay at a hotel for the night. I just couldn't stay in that house, knowing that there was a dead body in my yard. I thought, at the time, that would be the end of it. They would take his body, and the weirdness would end. Even if his spirit was somehow attached to my apartment, I would just move. His mother wouldn't want me living there anymore anyway, not after I had led to the death of her precious angel. I would just take my things and go elsewhere. When I woke up this morning to find the words "M'lady" written on the bathroom mirror, I knew then that this wasn't attached to my apartment. The haunting had nothing to do with my place at all. He's attached himself to me. Lying here, writing this, I can already hear his raspy, phlegm-filled breath from the corner of the room. It appears that unlike in life, I may be his m'lady after all, unwilling or not.